In addressing the question, what is the proper role of government, in video 1, we concluded that the nature of government is force, and, because of its nature, also concluded government must be limited. We assumed, for the most part, people believe that civil government should not have absolute power and should not be powerless. Thus, pretty much everyone believes in some form of limited government. That brought us to these key questions. What authority should government have, and how does one determine what authority is appropriate and what authority would be inappropriate? These questions are important because they are directly related to the concept and experience of liberty. And because the nature of government is force, everything it does is backed by the threat or use of violence. And because of that, we need to limit government to its proper role. To do this, we must apply standards based on good principles. We'll continue to look for these principles in order to develop good standards by moving on into this video on power and authority. We'll begin with an activity. What I would like you to do is to take a moment and list all of the people in your life that have authority over you. With your answers, be general. For example, instead of saying or listing all the names of your teachers who have authority over you, just simply write the word teacher. So take a moment, pause this video, and create a list of all those who have authority over you. Okay, now refer to your list and ask yourself this question. Why do these people have authority over me? Even more importantly, where does this authority come from? These are significant questions, especially the source of authority, because to have authority over someone implies that you have the right to use force to impose your will on another person to do something that you think they should do. Take, for example, a police officer catching someone stealing from a house. If a police officer has authority over that person, after they are caught, will be forced to go to jail. Without the ability to force someone to go to jail, the police officer can only recommend for this criminal, this person who violated another person's property rights, to go to jail. And of course, the person's going to say, nah, I don't feel like going. And law enforcement, as a result, does not work. So again, consider the source of authority. Where do these people get their authority to impose force on you if the circumstances require it? It's got to come from somewhere. So let's consider the answers to the questions we've been asking. In order to develop a sound understanding as to the proper role of government, one needs to understand or know the meaning of the words power and authority, how they're different, and how they are related. Let's define power. Power is the faculty of doing or performing anything, or the faculty of moving or of producing change in something. It is ability or strength. So if you have a lot of power, you can affect many. If you have little power, you can affect few. Next, let's define authority. Authority is the legal power or right to command or to act. For example, the authority of a prince over subjects, or of parents over children. Let's now consider how power and authority are related. We will do this by first thinking about yourself. Is it possible for you, as an individual, to have the power to do something you do not have the authority to do? Take a moment to pause the video and consider this question, along with focusing on teachers and government. Is it possible for teachers to exercise power in areas they do not have the authority? Same with government. I'm sure you came up with a list of examples for all three. An individual clearly can exercise power in areas they do not have the authority. By simply pushing someone, hitting someone, you as an individual could steal from another person. Now you have the power to do these things, but clearly not the authority. A teacher as an individual could do those things as well, but they could also use their position as a teacher to manipulate or force students to do those things that they do not have the authority to do. They could force them by using grades maybe as leverage. Back in the day, I did an activity where I gave 100 points to every one of the students. And they got to keep these 100 points if they did everything that was required. They would lose all these points if they failed to do what was required. And the things that they were required to do were certainly not in the bounds of my authority as a teacher. For example, I gave them a curfew. I told them what time they had to go to bed, what shows they could or could not watch, what music they could or could not listen to, how much TV they were allowed to watch, what they had to have in their lunch at school, and more. Anyway, a point of that lesson was to get students to think about questions of authority: the who, the why, the how, to what extent, to get them to think about the fact that authority figures do not have absolute power, that it's limited to their proper role. Let's move on to government. I'm sure it was not too difficult to list the ways government can use power in areas they have no authority. History is ripe with examples, and so the question remains: what should the relationship between power and authority be? What should that look like? To answer this question, let's consider the following points. First, power is simply the ability to do something, to produce change, whereas authority is legal power. It is the legitimate use of power. Therefore, all power exercised outside of authority would be illegitimate. Thus, good government is measured by the degree to which its use of power is limited to its proper authority, and the degree to which its authority is backed by appropriate power. Of course, the challenge is to contain this power to its proper authority. What we want to do is maintain a relationship between power and authority where power is limited to its proper authority. To show this visually, take a look at this image here. The red circle represents the extent of power and authority that the government has. Notice, they're exactly the same. What we want, basically, is to make sure that the power and authority of the civil government is balanced, perhaps demonstrated by this image here. We do not want to have one greater than the other. As stated earlier, this is not an easy task. It's a challenge to contain power to its proper authority. But if you don't, you'll get one of two other options. First, you could get a system where power is greater than authority. Looking at this image here, you'll notice that the extent of power this government has is symbolized by the square, and the authority it has to actually exercise power legally is surrounded in red. If power is greater than this authority, then it is very likely that this particular government exercises power in ways that violate the liberties and rights of their people. The other result would be a system where government has authority, as illustrated by the outside square, but lacks the power to actually enforce their entire authority. Such a government, of course, then would be too weak to be effective. Let's now consider the word authority. Notice that its root word is author. So another principle that we will apply here is that all authority has a source, an author. Of course, the question is, where does government get its authority? Who is its author? Or who is the author of its authority? What is or who is the source? Let's consider 6 possible options. First, one could argue there is no such thing as authority. You could deny the existence or need of an authority concept. However, without the concept of authority, there's no consideration of appropriateness or justice or the use of power. Just because you don't think there's an authority and you deny the concept of an authority does not mean power no longer exists. You still have power. And without that concept of authority, then there is no defense against unbridled power. Second, one could argue that the source of authority is power, that power creates authority, that might makes right. So if you have absolute power, you have absolute authority. If you have no power, you have no authority. If you want to do something, just claim the authority to do it. All you have to do is be able to exercise force or strength in a way that gets you what you want. If you can do that, according to this view, then you have the authority to do it. And the only way to lose authority in this system is when you yourself are overpowered. Clearly, this would not be ideal for anyone who wants to live in a place that enjoys liberty, freedom and security. Third, one could argue that authority comes from the majority. This would be a democracy. Instead of it being might makes right, in this case, it would be majority makes right. Government action that is opposed by a majority of its citizens would be considered an abuse of power from this perspective. Fourth, one could argue the divine right of kings perspective. This view credits God as the source of authority, but the monarch is the sole receiver and interpreter of God's direction. Thus, in this system, it is impossible for others to verify the will of God. The assumption is made then that the king's authority, although flowing from God, is still essentially absolute. Fifth, one could argue that authority comes from the individual. This limits government to doing only those things that an individual has authority to do. This perspective, along with the sixth, are elaborated upon in video 3. I'll see you there.